thanks to all of you for coming out. There's like 12 more of you than I thought there would be on Monday right after spring break. And as Harry mentioned, most of my work is on immigration and Latina sociology, and so doing something that is more broadly across race and also something that's directly related to violence is not exactly in my wheelhouse. And so I blame Ruben Ortiz, who's here. Wave to the crowd, Ruben. Ruben is a phenomenal doctoral student of mine who said, we should look at this. And he was right. It's incredibly interesting. And so when I was asked to give this talk, I thought, okay, so I'm going to bring this because those of you who do a lot of statistical modeling know that statistics is a feeling, right? Like, so we teach at the undergrad and early graduate level, we sort of teach statistics of like, if this, then this, and if the number's this, then this, and so it looks very, very rigid, but in fact, statistics is constantly about making choices, and the more you do it, the better you get at making the choices and the easier the choices are. Until I got to this project. And this was one of these projects where at every turn there were 4 options and there was no clear pathway. You can see Ruben nodding. No clear pathway. And so it was like, well, okay, well, let's just try everything. So this is, a project that is a lot like throwing spaghetti at a wall to see if it's done, And so I thought, okay, so now I'm in a room full of smart modeling people who are going to say, oh, you should try this other thing. Although I will say that we have tried about 1 million things. And so Ruben is here to answer all your tough questions. Okay, so our big overarching question is whether or not group threat, I'll get into what that is in a minute, but you can just think of it roughly as racial domination, contributes to the death of U.S. residents at the hands of police. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar with the statistics on police-involved killings, last year, 1,165 people that we know of were killed by the police in the United States. In 2015, which is the year that we're going to be talking about today, 1,146 people. So year after year, it looks like somewhere in the 1,100 is the number. In 2015, 1,146 dead, 544 of them were people of color. And so to just kind of put into context how many more people police kill in the United States than elsewhere, in Norway, the police have killed 4 people in the last 14 years. And I know you're going, well, Norway is a much smaller country than the United States, so I'll give you a little more balanced perspective. So in Tennessee in 2015, police killed 21 million people. Sorry, 21 million people. Police killed 21 people. Yeah, more than that. Yeah, that's some pretty amazing numbers. No, sorry, I learned everything I did from the president. Anyhow. That's on film, isn't it? Okay. So in Tennessee, there are 6.7 million people. And in 2015, police killed 21 of them. In Germany, by contrast, there's 83 million people, so arguably a lot more. And in that same year, police killed 2, right? California has a population that's less than half the size of Germany. And in that same year in California, 211 residents were killed by police, right? So police-involved killing is uniquely probably American and something we don't know nearly enough about. But some of the things that are pretty clear are that there's some unique spatial patterning to the deaths. That there are certain metropolitan areas where police kill a lot of people, and it doesn't really matter. Year after year after year, they're killing a lot of people. And then there are metropolitan areas where police hardly kill anybody, and year after year after year, they hardly kill anybody, right? So these are not blips. And they're not the places that you might imagine. So, oops. Sorry, I was expecting a pointer. I guess I don't have one. That's all right. Or do I? The red button in the middle, well, gosh, I couldn't find the big button. Okay, so here in Austin, Texas, nice liberal city, not very large, people have really good jobs. Police kill a lot of people, all right? So year after year, 3 times as many as they kill in Knoxville. On the other hand, in Memphis, city with one of the worst crime rates in the country, one of the worst violent crime rates in the country, police rarely kill anyone. That is also true of Boston, right? And this is a place where police have all kinds of bad reputation. And so you see these patterns. And so I asked Ruben to look at the correlation by the counts by place across time, and the correlation's really high. It's like, 0.9 something? 0.94, there we go. And so, the places that are killing a lot of people in year 1 are killing a lot of people in year 2, year 3, and so forth. So one of the questions, of course, is why? And then another puzzle we have has to do with the role of race in these killings. So just on the face, there appear to be clear racial disparities in who gets killed by the police. So more white people get killed than people of color. But there are more white people, right? So if we adjust for population size, so this is the rate of death per million people by race for 2015. And so you see that the rate is more than twice as large for blacks as it is for whites. If we look at, so these are one source of data. If we look at other sources of data, like Bueller did some work on death certificates, and looking at that, he concluded that blacks were 2.8 times more likely than whites to be killed by police, and Latinos were 1.7 times more likely than whites to be killed by police. And then some work by public health officials show that whites lose about 169 expected years of life due to police-involved killing. Blacks lose 674 years of life. That's just the years of life. Per year. Per year. Yeah, per year. But when we start to look at the research, the picture becomes more fuzzy than just to say, yeah, there's the clear patterning by race. So when we look at studies of simulations done with police officers, such as this one, Carell and his colleagues found that police officers in his simulations were actually more likely to kill armed and unarmed black men than they were to kill armed white men. But James and her colleagues actually found that police were less likely to shoot armed and unarmed black men than they were to shoot armed white men, right? So you have different simulation studies with different results. There's there are social psychologists in the room, so I'll just leave it there.
Were those studies done with the same police?
No. Different police officers, different times. They weren't in the same year, and they weren't in the same place, and they weren't exactly the same methods. So you have that. Probably the study that you're most familiar with, because it got a ton of traction in the news, was a study by Roland Pryor Jr. He's an economist at Harvard. And there was a New York Times study that everybody went crazy about. And the way that the paper was presented in the New York Times, which is not the way that Fryer presents the paper, but the way that the paper was presented by the New York Times was that Fryer had studied police and discovered that police were actually less likely to shoot black and Latinos than whites, or to kill black and Latinos than whites, and that when police encountered blacks and Latinos, they were more likely to look for non-lethal forms of violence to subdue them. That was what the New York Times said. That's not actually what the paper says. Okay, so first of all, this is a unpublished paper, right? So it's a working paper. It's not been peer-reviewed. That didn't show up in the New York Times either. So those of you who are like, oh, I read that paper and really? Okay, so, and what Pryor did is he looked at 11 metropolitan police departments out of the thousands in the US, and he looked at police's own records of incidences. And what he determined was that, conditioned on being stopped, that police were no more likely to shoot at blacks and Latinos than to shoot at white people, which is different than killing them, right? So police shoot at a lot more people than they kill. And that blacks and Latinos compared to whites were much more likely to be touched, to be handcuffed, to be pushed to the ground, and to be pepper sprayed. And so there are a number of issues here that Pryor rightfully acknowledges. One is it's an 11-city study. Two is you're looking at police's own accounts of what happened, which are probably not the most unbiased accounts, and it's conditioned on being stopped. So we have all kinds of criminological research that shows that police are much more likely to stop blacks and Latinos for the same crime as whites. So there are just issues kind of across the board there. And then finally, there are some who argue that adjusting for population size is just a bad idea. That we're actually creating a problem by adjusting for population, that we're creating the look of disparities where none exist. And here's the argument. So probably the most reasonable case from this comes from a criminologist named Joseph Cesario. And what he says is, look, if we adjust for population size, then we're assuming that everybody has the same chance of being killed by the police. So arguably, if I'm robbing a liquor store, I'm more likely to be killed by the police than if I'm teaching Sunday school, right? And so population adjustment doesn't take that into account. And so in a paper that he published in Social Psychology and Personality Science in 2018, he shows that if instead of adjusting for population size, you adjust for race-specific gun violence, race-specific gun crimes, that whites are actually more likely to be killed by police by being shot than blacks. He doesn't study Latinos. Or he does study Latinos, but he doesn't have Latino data, so he uses the white data to apply to Latinos. Okay. Yes?
Just clarify, what is the condition? What is if you adjust for?
So here we're just adjusting for, so this is like how many people per million Native Americans. How many Native Americans per million? Okay, what he's doing is he's just adjusting for the number of crimes committed. So here's the number, here's how many gun crimes. So he does it at the national level, and he says, okay, this is how many blacks were killed by the police, and we're, instead of dividing it by population, we're going to divide it by the number of gun crimes committed by black people. Okay, yeah. So right now, these are just national. This is all just national. This is everything. Pryor's is across the 11 cities.
Doesn't differentiate the fact that Houston is a very different city.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, God.
Ding, ding, ding. That's the point of our study here, right? So a big problem that we have, I'll get to you in 1 second. So a big problem that we have with Cesario is, well, A, we actually did a study and said, which fits the model better, right? Which is a better model fit? Population or crime? And hey, population actually is a better model fit. But beyond that, yeah, by studying this at the national level, you miss all of these differences that are so glaring across place. Please, go ahead.
So I am not a sociologist at all. I'm a mathematician. I don't know about these things.
Okay.
So I have a question about the adjusting by crimes.
Uh-huh.
I understand that there are like different, there are reported crimes.
Yeah,
There are
okay.
crimes that people are arrested
Are you
for,
sure you're not a sociologist?
that people
Okay.
are prosecuted for, and
Yeah.
there are crimes that people are convicted of. Which of those?
Ruben.
Cesario actually adjusts by the number of arrests
question. I mean, a lot of people get arrested, don't get convicted or something, or they stay. So that gets really murky. So what he does is he takes arrest data, race-specific arrest data rather, for I think over 13 different offenses, and he adjusts the rate of people killed by that. And he finds that in fact, according to him, is whites were disproportionately killed by race.
And people of color are more likely to be arrested. Right. Yeah, go ahead. When? I think, so let's talk about that for a second. So Pryor, of course, has that information because he has the police, or to the extent that the police actually told him that. Or wrote that in their reports, he has that. We don't have that. But one of the things that's, I guess I should make really clear, first of all, there's lots of ways you can be killed by police, right? And it doesn't have to be that you're shot, right? So you can get run over by the police. In our data, we have people who were in jail. They were being annoying, so they shut off the water to their cell and then didn't turn it back on. You can be handcuffed and choking or whatever and be ignored and die. You can be tased 169 times, right? And so there are lots of ways to die, and then also you don't necessarily have to be in custody to be killed, right? And so there are a lot of deaths to people who are not ever in custody. They're never handcuffed, they're never anything, right? And right. And so there are even incidences. So there's a woman in Chicago who called the police because her neighbor's adult son was beating up her neighbor. And so the police show up at the scene. She opens the door to talk to the police. The police turn around and shoot her and kill her, right? And we saw that, right? This famous case in Minneapolis. Was it a Swedish woman who called the police and then stepped out? So that happens not infrequently. Okay, so I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah, go ahead.
Roughly of the 1,100 or so killed each year by police, what fraction are shootings?
Most of it, 90%?
Yeah, around 90%.
Yeah. We have that somewhere. Okay, so what we are interested in is to what extent racism contributes to police-involved killings at the metropolitan area level. So we really want to get at a finer examination of place than what we have seen in many studies. And I guess coming into this audience, I want to take a moment and just make sure that we're all on the same page in thinking about racism, because I think the typical American thinks about racism as like somebody has some kind of negative ideas, and because of that, they engage in some kind of racist act, which then leads to racial disparities, right? So let's say Lou really hates Danish people, and so and so anytime Soren Sorensen comes up for anything that Lou's on the selection committee, Lou's just like, no, right? And so over time, there's no awards to anybody who's Danish. Okay, that's kind of crazy. But this is kind of how we tend to think about police-involved killing, right? So there are racist cops, and those racist cops kill people of color, and so you have disparities in the outcome. But this is not really how most social scientists think, who study race, think about racism, because what we know from all kinds of studies is over time, it appears that people hold less of the kinds of things we think of as racist beliefs. We have seen from audit studies and so forth that over time, it's not that discrimination has gone away, but there are fewer acts of discrimination, and yet racial disparities continue to persist and in many cases have become worse. And so we have to be more nuanced in our thinking about race. Back in the 1950s, a professor at UC Berkeley, Herbert Blumer, wrote a really small paper. It's like 3 pages long, and I encourage anybody who's interested in race to read it. And it's just called Race Prejudice as a Sense of Group Position. And so Blumer is really the first person to say, we need to not think about racism as just individuals' ideas or the, here's a bunch of people together, and so the sum of their ideas. But we need to think of racism as interactions between people, something that actually happens at a group level. And so Hubert Blaylock took this idea and ran with it, and he expounded on it in an influential book and a whole bunch of papers. And what he does is he basically shows how, as the outgroup, so as a racial minority group increases in size relative to the white population, you see more acts of racial antagonism. I cannot come up with the word. Help me. Antagonism, thank you. At the place level, right? So you have more racist acts that happen as a minority group gets larger relative to white population, and also as the minority group gains position. So as they increase in income, employment, and so forth relative to the white group. And so we call this collectively the threat hypothesis. And over time, so since the 60s, when Blaylock came out with this, people have taken these models in various forms and applied them to all kinds of potentially racial discriminatory outcomes and have consistently found time and time again that the models work. And so Ruben and I were particularly influenced by the work of Woody Beck. Woody Beck is actually a UT sociology PhD graduate, but was the head of the sociology department at Georgia for many years. And he is one of the nation's leading scholars on historical lynchings and also on Klan activity. And so he has paper on historical lynchings that show that you can predict where lynchings were going to occur and how many lynchings occurred based on Blumer and Blaylock's model. And then more recently in the 2000s, he does this with modern day Klan activity. He uses Blumer and Blaylock to show that you can predict the number of Klan activities that will occur in counties using Blumer and Blaylock's threat models. We thought, well, heck, Klan activity is kind of indisputably racist activity. So if these models that predict that also predict police-involved killing, that may give us some traction on this question of what's happening. And so again, we'll keep asking the question, does group threat predict the expected count of police-involved killings? We're looking at the metropolitan area because, true to Blumer and Blaylock, we think that the local culture of a place is at the metro area. So like I said, we have like riddle, and the first one is, what do you use for data? Okay, so there are no good official sources of data on police-involved killing, right? So we have death certificates. So let's say I walk out of the door and police are in a high-speed chase and they run over me with their car and kill me. Whoever fills out the death certificate gets to decide what I died from. So I can die from legal intervention and then I get picked up as police-involved killing, or they can put down that I died from a car accident, right? And then I don't get picked up. So the death certificates undercount who gets killed. There is also a FBI reporting system where if there's a death in custody, a police department can report it to the FBI, but they don't have to, right? So something like 43% of police departments don't. And it's actually called, justifiable homicide or death in custody, right? And so let's say, I talked about this woman, Betty, in Chicago, who walked out of her door and got shot by the police. She wasn't in custody, so she wouldn't necessarily get reported if that police department reports to the FBI. And the situation is so bad that you may be familiar with James Comey. When he was FBI director in 2014, he went on the record of saying that it was embarrassing and ridiculous that there were no official data on police-involved killings. So because these data do not, well, they exist, but they're bad, other private people and organizations have taken on the task of trying to figure out who's being killed by the police. What we're using for data, and these aren't the only data, is the British newspaper The Guardian started a project called The Counted. And so what they did is they said, we want to crowdsource everybody who's been killed by the police starting January 1st, 2016. So basically, people would contact them and say, this person was killed or this person was killed. And then they used a team of journalists to verify all of that. So it's crowdsourced, but it's verified crowdsourced. Washington Post has a similar project, but Washington Post data are limited just to shootings, which are most of them, but just shootings. And then there are some others that are crowdsourced but not verified. So for sort of a holistic picture that we feel is pretty good data, we have used the data from The Counted, and you can just Google The Counted, The Guardian, and you can find these data. They're not complete, right? So a couple things happened in 2015 that you might remember. One was Sandra Bland. The Sandra Bland case, this is the woman who was arrested in Texas by the cop who said he was going to light her up because she was smoking a cigarette at a traffic stop. She supposedly or purportedly committed suicide in jail. A lot of people are suspicious of that, but she's not here because officially she committed suicide. Probably a much bigger deal is that was also the year that there was a big shootout between the cops and bikers at one of these restaurants in Texas. And to this date, we don't know who killed whom, right? So none of those people are in here. Or if we know who killed whom, nobody's saying. So those are our data. In The Counted, every single death is geocoded, like we have the exact address that the person died. And so we're able to geocode those deaths to really whatever level we want, and we decided to geocode them to the metropolitan area level. What this means is we don't have in our analyses people who died in a non-metro place, but that's not that many people, all right? We also, it's rare, but there's also sometimes the case where a crime started here and the police chased the people and then they died over here, and so they get counted as dying here, but the people who killed them are from here, but that's more rare. What we do in our analyses, we have 4 different dependent variables. We have a count of everybody who died. We have a count of people of color who died, unrepresented minorities who died, a count of just blacks who died, and a count of non-Latino whites who died. Our variables of interest are the ones that come from Blumer and Blaylock. We have the size of the black population relative to the white population, and the size of the Latino population relative to the white population. Then we have, at the metropolitan level, average income for blacks relative to average income for whites, and average income for Latinas relative to average income for per capita income for whites. And then we have a measure of exposure. There's lots of measures of exposure. The one we used, okay, the brackets are a little screwed up, apparently. Doesn't translate well to PowerPoint, but exposure is one of these things that demographers, geographers, and sociologists use that approximates how integrated neighborhoods are. There's lots of ways you can look at this. And so in this particular instance, B here is for black and white is W is for white. What you're looking at is the probability that if you are black, you will encounter someone who's white in your neighborhood. Now that assumes, first of all, that you have an equal chance of encountering everybody in your neighborhood, and it also assumes that you only encounter people who live in your neighborhood. All right, and so those are both kind of crazy assumptions, but just as kind of a crude measure of how integrated the neighborhoods are at that metro level, this gives us a sense of that. All right, and in our study, we control for the violent crime rate. We spent a lot of time thinking about all the possible crime rates we could use, and we finally said, well, this is what other criminologists have used, so we'll probably get less beat up by reviewers going that way. I'm not sure it's the best rate, but it's the one we used. And then population size. The basic idea there is, first of all, bigger places should probably have more police, and to the extent that police represent a chance to be killed by police, but also more people, more chances to die, right? Okay. And then we run into this problem, which is we have a dependent variable that's a count variable, and there are a large number of ways that we can model this, all right? So first thing that probably pops to a lot of people's mind is Poisson regression, but you know, data on humans is almost always over dispersed, so then you go to a negative binomial. But then we have the question of, do we need to adjust for zero inflation? So stop me if I'm telling you stuff you already know. So the problem of excess zeros is not a matter of you have too many metropolitan areas with zero killings. It's a problem of that you have zeros from two different sources. All right, so that's what zero inflation means. That's an easy thing to think about if we were thinking about something like fishing, right? Like let's say you were gonna go out and you were gonna survey campers and ask them how many fish they caught, and you're gonna have campers who caught no fish because they're lousy at fishing, and you have campers who caught no fish because they didn't fish. So you have zeros from two sources. It's hard theoretically to think about you have metropolitan areas where nobody died because police didn't kill them, and you have metropolitan areas where nobody died because police didn't have any opportunity to kill them. Like that second thing seems unlikely. Mathematically, it looks like we have zeros from two sources, that we have this excess zero problem. Theoretically, we can't get our heads there. We asked a lot of statisticians and they all went, you know. So we just kind of modeled it and said, what happens? And what you can see here is that the negative binomial regression model that is not adjusted for zero inflation seems to do kind of the best job of predicting. And so that's what we used. We could have run hurdle models. We didn't. All right. And then we run into this problem of what exactly is the relationship of these threat variables to our outcome, because even Blumer and Blaylock think there's three possibilities, right? So you could, like, for each, let's just take population, size, and whatever you want to pick over here, right? So it could be that as the minority population grows, you're matched with equal sort of racial hostility. It could be that at low levels, the hostility escalates pretty quickly, and then at some level, someplace it kind of levels out. My example here would be Alabama, right? Alabama, who passed all this crazy anti-immigrant legislation because they have like almost no unauthorized immigrants. Like they have so few that California looks at them and goes, oh, isn't that cute? Or you can have power threat, which is that increases in minority group size are kind of tolerated to a point, and then when they start to potentially threaten to take power, then the hostility increases. Blaylock suggests any of these things can happen. We tested them all. So these are the AICs from models of testing it 3 different ways. And what we find across the board is the economic competition, just taking the natural log of our predictors, gives us the best fitting models. All right. Okay, now I'm showing you stuff and you're like, I can't see that. And I'm not really that mean. Will you give these to people? It really wouldn't matter how big the numbers are. I would not be able to see them on the screen anyway, so I just said, I'm just going to hand you the model and you can look at it. All right. So what we have here, we'll just start with the controls. So what we see in all of the models, whether we're talking about all deaths, minority deaths, black deaths, whatever, population, bigger places have more deaths. And that's what we expected. But interestingly, violent crime is only significant in predicting all deaths and white deaths. And we don't think, I mean, we looked at it, it doesn't look like it's just due to, you know, I mean, the sample sizes stay the same and the counts get smaller. So this is sort of an interesting finding that I will return to in a moment. When we look at the answers to our overarching research question, what we find is when the black population increases relative to whites, we see increases in the expected count of black deaths and minority deaths, but not all deaths and not white deaths, right? So this is very much in line with Blumer and Blaylock. For the Latino population, as the Latino population increases relative to the white population, we see an increase in all of the death categories except for black deaths. We don't see anything related to income. None of those findings are significant, and we'll go further and say in most of the studies that we look at, this variable is not significant, so we're kind of on board with everybody else. When we look at exposure, and this is interesting, Michael and I had an interesting conversation about this, and I might even get him to just explain it, but I'll come back to it. That places where blacks are actually living, in areas where you have more blacks living with whites in mixed race neighborhoods, you actually have more deaths to everybody, but also specifically it's significantly associated with more deaths to white people. And I'll again return to that. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, we have conclusions, but mostly they're just questions worded in the form of conclusions. So first of all, what we see is we have some evidence here, pretty good evidence actually, that the models that predict things like Klan activity and lynchings also predict deaths to people of color and especially to blacks, right, at the metropolitan level currently. What we think is interesting, though, with regard to exposure is that nationally, black-white exposure is on the decline. In other words, blacks are actually less likely now than they were in the past to live in neighborhoods where they're going to encounter white people. But what our models show is that the places where you do have more of these mixed race neighborhoods, you have more deaths to white people. So I said to Michael, what do you think's happening there? And Michael said, ooh, I think it's about decentering whiteness and prototypicality threat. And I thought, yeah, okay, I have not heard that word ever. All right. But, you know, why don't you explain it?
Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Wilson. I'm a professor in psychology. So my idea, and this is just half-assed bullshit, so just take it with a grain of salt, but this notion of prototypicality threat among whites is this notion that we, as white people, do see ourselves as the sort of default race and sort of our neighborhood is fine and good as it is. And to the extent that black and brown folks start moving into it, we see that as a threat to step down, whereas they see it as potentially to step up, or at least they don't. Because it's more threatening among white folks to see black and brown folks enter in, they're more likely to show threat-like responses, like aggression toward those folks. And so what you end up with is a situation where white folks are
I mean, we have currently no data to test this, but I did go and look, and so there have been studies that have looked at the increase in membership in pretty hostile white supremacist groups, the kind of white supremacist groups that go out and do criminal activities. And one of the factors in this association are people are more likely to join these activities if there are Black and Latino people moving into their neighborhoods, right? One of the things that we think is particularly interesting in our findings is that places with more violent crime significantly predict an expected count of white deaths, but not deaths to people of color and not deaths to blacks. And this is interesting, right? Because usually we think of the killing of people by police as part of the sort of, they needed killing, right, story, right? So it's well, of course these people died because they're violent criminals, or of course these people died because they were non-compliant with the police or so forth. But the association of violent criminality with police-involved killing seems to mostly work for the killing of white people. Yeah, Lou, go ahead.
I want to make sure I understand.
Yeah.
More violent crime.
Uh-huh. Crimes per 100,000 residents, yeah.
More deaths, is that more deaths per capita?
No, it's the expected count of deaths,
This is
actual counts.
so this is involved with places that have more violent crime and have very different racial distribution.
Very much so. So we don't know,
What happens
yeah.
if you, instead of saying counts there, you said per capita?
I think we did that, yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry. We wouldn't necessarily model this count data like that, right? Because of various reasons why you wouldn't model it per capita, right? So when I model this count, this is what we get. I mean, the literature specifically, cautions researchers to not model this as a per capita or transformer to run it as a linear model and run it as actual count.
The issue is you're talking about rare events, right? And so if you take a rare event and turn it into a rate per capita, then you run into problems of exaggeration. That being said, yeah, so just as a speculative,
You're doing the violent crime.
yeah, we're doing,
So
yeah.
I don't understand. They're different.
So the violent crime is really a measure of, how violent is the city, sort of, right? So the idea is, if you're in a more violent city, police might be more guarded. They might, so police in Knoxville, presumably on a daily basis, are dealing with, kittens up trees and speeders yeah, okay, but, people. People kiting checks and, things of that nature. And, police in Memphis are dealing with, active shooter situations. And so you have, and homicides and things like that. So, if you're just thinking again about what is the culture of the city, of the metropolitan area, how is threat perceived? We would assume there's a larger perception of threat in places where there's more crime. But again, what we're seeing here is, the places with more violent crime have more deaths to have the rate of violent crime predicts the expected count of white deaths, but not of black and minority deaths. I mean, that's what I can say to you. I don't know if I've explained to you why. Yeah. 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 Go ahead.
Just a quick follow-up question on that. It makes sense to me why you wouldn't want your model output to be per capita or something.
Right.
But once you have the output of the count,
Yeah.
why then couldn't you take that output and put it per 100,000 people?
We could. And we haven't. And so actually that's a really good idea. And I think that's kind of also what Lou is asking, right? So we can say, okay, where are these places where these white people are dying, right? And so it's worth looking at. Yeah. Larger places experience more deaths, and that's sort of obvious, but it's interesting because there's two possibilities there, right? I mean, one possibility is that, if something is somewhat random, right? I mean, if something, then where you have more people, that outcome is more likely to happen. So it could just be that it's purely a function of population. It's also possible that it's a function of the size of the police force. So bigger places may have more police, and to the extent that that every single police officer represents a potential threat of dying, then that's the issue. And so one of the things, we have not modeled the size of the number of police at the metropolitan area, and we haven't done it for a couple of reasons. One is because we really wanted to stay true to Blumer and Blaylock, which is really looking at the place, and we wanted to look at the proximate determinants and not the distal determinants, right? So we didn't want to focus on police. That being said, the other thing is, you have all these different kinds of police organizations happening at the metropolitan level. So you'll have your county sheriff, your city police, and all of this. And, in any individual death, you could have one agency involved or 12 agencies involved, and sometimes the feds are there. And so we weren't really sure how you would even measure that. I mean, we could just do something as crude as just say, okay, this is how many police there are in this metropolitan area, and just leave it at that. But we haven't done that yet, and so it's something to think about. Yeah, go ahead.
The presence in any given neighborhood maybe more important than the actual number of police.
Yeah. We think that's hugely important and really hard to measure at the national level. So one of the things that is very possible, right, is, I don't want to take you too much down a rabbit hole, but we have a colleague, Casey Henricks, who has looked at the fact that we had all these tax revolts in the 80s. And so as a consequence, politicians are very reluctant to raise taxes at any level of government. And this all occurred at the time that the federal government was giving less and less money to states and cities. And so municipal areas had to come up with ways to raise funds. And so one of the ways you do that, if you can't tax people, is to have a lottery. That works for states. But for cities, you just fine the crap out of people, right? And so you fine people for driving 5 miles over the speed limit, and for jaywalking, and for doing all of these kinds of things. And what we're seeing from work by Dr. Henricks and others is that you're seeing in these places where the cities are relying heavily on fines and fees for their revenue, they're concentrating police in poor neighborhoods, which are often minority neighborhoods, right? And so if it's the case that the reason we're seeing these racial disparities is because policing is just getting concentrated in these areas, that would explain the racial disparities. It's something that we're interested in. It's another study, and it's something that probably needs a lot of grant money and a lot of people and a lot. There's a lot of, but there are some inroads into some data to get that. Yeah.
Another question, you did a scatter plot for a number of police involved killings.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Yeah, so just so we're familiar, so there's a place called Officer Down Memorial page. You can go online and you can look at it, and it'll tell you that there's X number of police that die every year they die in the line of duty, right? If you go and you read those, what you discover pretty soon is most police who die in the line of duty have heart attacks, all right? And so if you limit that to, and also some of those police who die in the line of duty, and I'm not kidding about this, are dogs, right? So police dogs are considered officers, and that's fine. I don't have a problem with that, except that the officers are dying because they're being left in cars, when it's hot. And so, so that happens kind of sickeningly frequently. So when you start to say, okay, how many police officers are actually killed a year for the whole country, it's somewhere between 30 and 40. Killed by like a bad guy, right? As opposed to in a training accident or having a heart attack or being left in a car. Yeah. And so that was one thing we initially thought about is like, well, maybe we should control for whether there was an officer had died in the previous year or something. And then we were like, yeah, it happens so infrequently. Yeah. 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 Yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying. Ruben, have you read work on this?
I have not concentrated solely on rural areas as part of this project. I know that's an area that I have to go deeper. I know that previous studies that were done, like ethnographic studies on police response times, looking at the differences between rural and urban areas, there seems to be a rapid response time, like you said, in urban areas. However, when you're looking at police-involved killings, the response time seems to be quite consistent in the urban areas and rural areas. So, what are the differences between both of them? I have not looked at that personally. But I guess we could.
And I guess related to that, one of the things that sort of strikes me with these data is how many police are on the scene, usually. I mean, there's usually a lot of police on the scene. And so that suggests that, I don't know, must be able to get there, you know? All right, so this is really what we have so far. And like I said, I mean, we're just, you know, there's so many possibilities at every turn. Like we could do this, we could do this, we could look at this, we could look at that. So like I said, we're really curious about, you know, from a theoretical perspective, you know, our findings are very much in line with theory in a way that, you know, no one's looked at it before, but, you know, it's sort of a larger sense of, you know, we have no information. We can't tell you why, right? Why we can tell you where these things are happening. We can tell you the conditions, but, you know, really, you know, how that translates into violence. It's not an answer that we have at this point, but it is something that we're interested in. So yeah.
There's this odd thing in the data that's hard for me to reconcile. The top two is the black or white population and then Latino for white population. With the first ratio predicting black deaths, but the second ratio white deaths. That is the more Latino death versus the white population, the more white death.
Yeah.
Trying to understand.
Yeah. Yeah. Do I have an answer for that? No. And these are non-Latino white deaths, right? So these are, you know, a lot of Latinos identify as white, and so we separated that out. So this is my best guess, all right? And so in some studies, we actually control for whether, so if you look at where people are most likely to be killed by police, if you're looking at a map of, let's say this is a map of the United States, if you start at Texas, move across the south through like Arizona and New Mexico, and then go up the west coast, that's where most of the deaths are concentrated, right? Which is also where Latinos are concentrated. So it could be that it's nothing to do with Latinos and everything to do with, you know, I mean, it could be an artifice of this is where deaths, so we controlled for the west, and it was not significant, right? But we may need to do something more specific than that.
It's not even possible
Yeah, I mean, it's, I have no idea, but very possibly. I will also add, and this is something I forgot to say, was we took Los Angeles out of these analyses because Los Angeles, in metropolitan Los Angeles, so many people, like 65 people get killed every year. We also have run the analysis with Los Angeles. It distorts the model quite a lot, but it is real data. Chicago's in here. Yeah.
Do you look at all at corruption
Yeah.
in the police municipality, the local police structures, and how that might be associated
Yeah.
with deaths?
Well, again, we haven't, because we're trying to say, we're trying to come at it theoretically from the case of, like, police are people who live in a place and they're subject to all the same, to the extent that racism occurs because of interactions between people. Cops are the same as everybody else who lives in an area, and so we didn't want to look at policing. There have been some great ethnographic studies that have looked specifically at the culture of policing and how that relates to police. And so, for example, you can imagine, police departments have recruiting videos, and you can have recruiting videos that are like, here at the, Knoxville, police department, we take pride in our community and blah, blah, blah. And that's your recruiting video. And then you have the recruiting videos that are playing like heavy metal music, and you've got cops, you've got flashing lights, and you've got guns. And, police department B is going to recruit different kinds of people than police department A, right? And so there have been studies like that that have been, very specific to small locations, but nothing at a national scale.
I guess I was thinking corruption might be associated more with less of a rule of law.
Yeah.
You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
Yeah. Be a hard thing to measure.
There's lots of questions.
Yeah.
So, I don't know the answer to this.
Okay.
Are there relative differences across the metropolitan areas in compensation for police officers relative to the at-mean compensation in the metropolitan area?
Are there data?
That's one of the biggest problem here is the data. So we were actually looking at the relative percent of blacks to whites who are in professional, managerial and professional occupations, right? The highest in the job, per se. And what happens is we reduce the sample by half if we include that data.
Because the data are missing, yeah.
We just have tons of missing data, so kind of dealing with that missingness has been problematic, specifically for data.
And so then data on, so getting data on police compensation gets really complicated because, some places it's like, this is the average for all the cops. Well, that could include at the very highest level, the very lowest level, which is not, and so, of course, these problems, right? But I don't even know where those data, if those data exist.
So I'm still digging around to support my Lawrenceville.
Okay.
realistic threat
Yeah.
theory. And, given all we know about the effects of income inequality in terms of crime,
Yeah.
just income, I'm supposing that's income at the metropolitan level or
So it's average, it's the average income for blacks, per capita income for blacks, yeah. And there's, again, back here, it's like 15 ways we could measure that.
I mean, it would be great if we could look at it in terms of income inequality. There are indices of income inequality at the metro level.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I would expect to see something going on with income, because I am struck at the lack of effective
Yeah.
But income inequality might be something.
Yeah, it's very possible, although, there's a ton of studies on group threat with all kinds of different dependent variables, and I've not seen any measure of income do anything. And that may be just because people don't know what other people make. Yeah.
They might see the neighbor with the nice car.
Yeah, but then they assume they got the nice car because they cheated on welfare. Yeah. Yeah. Oh. Well, I can't do that because that's Ruben's dissertation. Um, um, yeah.
So just to answer your question, that's kind of what I'm doing. Well, it is what I'm doing for my dissertation, right? I'm looking at more dynamic indicators of threat, right? So I'm looking at a change in the last 10 years. So that might be more meaningful as opposed to just static indicator. This is the ratio. So I'm accounting for that in my dissertation, which is not something about.
I was wondering if there was any correlation between police deaths of race versus background deaths or non-natural deaths. So we see similar ratios.
Oh,
And so if you look at an urban area, right, you see non-natural deaths
oh.
being reached.
Okay, so.
Could be murders against each other and non.
Yeah, so basically, relationship between police-involved killings and homicides is really at the race-specific homicides, right? And so we've done a little bit of that.
Yeah, we ran race-specific models for that crime data, and we have not found that.
Race-specific homicide,
Right.
yeah.
The last thing, the other thing I thought might be interesting is looking at human site relative to interstate. As a non-urban metric, whether or not more deaths are occurring closer to transportation. And that would be urban areas with denser transportation networks. And might get more than urban, but well.
Well, we have, like I said, we have the exact address of every death in 2015, so you could geocode that any way you wanted, yeah.
Because you're in the middle of
Yeah.
county on steps 5.
Yeah. There's a question over here.
So I'm curious, I think most of it is based on white policemen seeking the rest of them. So
Not necessarily.
When you look at the ratios, dividing
Yeah.
what policemen were white.
Yeah.
So there are any difference between them. So you just look at the causality of the racism.
Yeah.
You get different races for the police.
There have been studies that have looked at whether or not having more police who are people of color on the force reduces police violence of every level, not just police killing people, but police beating people up and so forth. And the studies I've read, Ruben's arguably read a lot more, have shown that that doesn't make a bit of difference, right? And so that's consistent with our theory, which is that this threat is operating across the city. So to the extent, right, so arguably if police kill people, most of the time they're killing people because they believe that person is a threat to them or to others around them, right? You don't have to be white to think that a black man is a threat, right? And so what I've seen in the literature is, yeah, that bears out that it doesn't really matter what the race of the police are. And certainly there are police of color who kill people.
So sociologically, this is racism, or this is like economic hate for poor people? Because I don't understand.
So it's race.
Is that threat because of the
Yeah.
race, or is that threat because normally in that city, black people are poor,
Yeah.
the ones committing crimes?
So people of color are not more likely to be committing crimes, but to the extent that we see racial disparities in these outcomes, and those racial disparities don't have to come from individual attitudes, they can come from any kind of structural factors. Yeah, we consider that part of the racial project, part of racial domination, yeah.
So just one thing quickly. So the literature on use of excessive force and use of force with substance, for example, right, consistently points out that you don't have that difference between race. So
To sort of get at that a little more, lots of elite universities have legacy admissions, right? So if your dad went to Harvard, then you have an easier time of getting into Harvard. And so if you look at two people who are equal on everything else, if this person's parent is a legacy parent, the other person has to have SAT scores that are 160 points higher to have the same chance of admission, right? That's how much legacy matters. Well, if you say, okay, what does the pool of legacy applicants look like? 93% of all people who could get into elite universities on legacy are white. So legacy isn't designed to keep schools white. It's designed to attract the children and grandchildren of people who went there in order to get more money to the institution, right? But we would still consider that racism, right? Structural racism.
This is kind of maybe the same question you just asked. I wondered about the demographics of a police department relative to the demographics of the city. Because I grew up here, Benton Harbor, Michigan,
Mm-hmm.
where most of the police are black.
Yeah.
And most of the residents most of the police are white.
And most of the residents are black. Mm-hmm.
And there's definitely a feeling in the city that has something to do with some of the deaths that occur. So not necessarily just like how many people of color are there in the police force, but how accurately do the demographics of the police force reflect the demographics of the people they serve.
Yeah, so I mean, we're not looking at police, but a lot of people have looked at police, and so Benton Harbor's interesting because Benton Harbor is one of those smaller places that has an excessively large number of police involved killings year after year after year, among other things, right? And
Had some fun riots.
yeah, Benton Harbor has some issues, and so. But like I said, it does, and so there's always issues where you have residents of color and a white power structure, and whether, to the extent that those, so going back and putting on my other hat as a Latino scholar, right, what I saw a lot was the perception, at least among the Latino community, was we look at and we see these white cops and we think they're out to get us, whether they are or not. That's certainly the perception. Like I said, the evidence in the published literature seems to suggest that the race of the police doesn't matter that much, but what that means though too, right? So if people, here's my concern, and I will say it's completely, I have no data on it because the most recent stuff from the Marshall Foundation and so forth says, the deaths to police haven't gone up. But my concern is as we're making these police-involved deaths more public and things are happening like happened with Antoine Rose yesterday, where, guy gets shot in the back who's unarmed, and then the jury says, oh, well, the police were reasonable fear for their life, right? As these things become more public in a situation where you have black residents and white police, that the concern is any interaction I have with this cop could result in my death, so I need to get the jump on them. I worry that is where we're headed, but again, the most recent data suggests that the killing of police is not on the rise.
And there has been literature on that specific factor, right? The proportion of white and black police officers through that population. There has been no evidence so far that has
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering about the population and that very strong impact that it seems to have.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether you have more police for a larger population, but do you have more police per capita, or do you actually have fewer police per capita?
Don't know. I don't know. And so that's what the thing is like, should we go down that rabbit hole? We're not sure. And, and so some of it's like, do you have more killings just because you can even also have more, you're talking about, again, relatively rare events. So maybe you have more collateral damage, right? More people who will accidentally get run over by police cars, or more people who will end up in the line of fire accidentally or whatever.
I think it can be traumatic.
Uh-huh.
in Tallahassee before I came here. And I lived basically, if I had to get there, it took me 5 minutes from where I lived to campus. It was impossible for me to get from where I lived to campus without encountering at least one cop car somewhere. Here I live 25 minutes from town. And I have no idea how many times I've driven this 25 minutes, this distance, without ever seeing a cop. So the cities are about the same size. So basically, why does Tallahassee have such an intense police force? It's partly because it's the capital, state capital. But nevertheless, and I have no idea what the crime rates look like. I mean, the death,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
killing rates, etc. I mean, the differences are so dramatic.
I mean, one of the recurring issues that we address in urban sociology is just like why places that look really very much the same are very different, right? And so you compare Boise and Knoxville, which are two cities of the same size with big state universities with a river through them at the base of outdoor at the foot of outdoor recreation. There's all these things, they're about the same percent conservative, right? All of these things, and they are wildly different cities, right? I mean, and if you don't believe it, like you can bike anywhere you want in Boise and feel safe because drivers look for cyclists. Here you're going to die, right? So, I mean, it's a question, and that's and so it's part of what we're trying to get at is, with very crude measures, but measures that work is what is it about a place that lends itself to these things?
I think we should thank Stephanie and Eric as an invitation that you can bike all over Knoxville and not down.
Okay. If you're, all right, thank you.